Joining us now, friend of the program, ESPN college football expert and analyst Trevor Matich, usually on Matich Mondays, but it's been a Trevor Thursday, and for the second consecutive week
That's right.
we have a Trevor Thursday. Trevor, welcome back. What was your initial reaction to the ACC excluding BYU?
Well, you know, if you're going to exclude BYU, it's the problem they have is that they're talking about going with a scheduled game against a big conference team for non-conference. They've got a 5-game rotation every year with Notre Dame. And in addition to that, you've got teams that'll play in, for example, the Kickoff Classic in Atlanta and other big non-conference games earlier in the season. And I think BYU just doesn't quite fit in over there because of what they're being asked to do from a non-conference standpoint. Now you're adding another potential loss.
Let's look at the ACC specifically, Trevor. BYU has 3 future games scheduled with an ACC team. That's Virginia. This season, then I believe 2019 and 20. Does BYU even need games against the ACC necessarily? They want them, but do they need them?
Well, it would be nice to have them because they're high-profile games on the East Coast, and that helps with recruiting. It also helps with television viewership. It just drums up interest everywhere. And so, you know, that's I think, a good thing for BYU to have. I mean, you go to Atlanta and play Georgia Tech, for goodness sake. I mean, that's a very positive thing. But they can still go to Central Florida, which is a game they've got scheduled. They can still go to other schools on the East Coast, but the ACC are the big schools on the East Coast, and so that's I think a loss for BYU from a recruiting standpoint and from an interest standpoint.
Why do you think this is creating so much angst among national college football writers such as yourself and Kirk Herbstreit, who said, I think the ACC and SEC should include BYU. It's a no-brainer. What's causing this rift among national pundits in college football?
Well, I think everybody wants to see big games, and BYU is a big brand name game. And I think people that follow college football understand how interesting BYU is from a national standpoint. There's a lot of history there, but there's also a lot of very good football played by BYU. And that's why I think they like to see the matchups. Plus, you see differences in culture. You've got BYU coming out of Provo, Utah, with the culture of the honor code and everything else, going up against the big bad boys. And I go back to the season opener a couple of years ago when they went down to Dallas and played Oklahoma. And BYU got into just an ugly alley fight with the big bad Sooners, and they beat them at that ugly alley fight. Those clean-cut, mostly married, return missionary, nice guys went out there and won a nasty fight. And that kind of a culture matchup, I think, is a good thing for college football. And I think that's one of the reasons that pundits and fans would like to see more of BYU against teams like that.
ESPN's Trevor Matich is on BYU Sports Nation, a member of the 1984 National Championship team for BYU. We've discussed kind of the BYU angle and then everyone else's angle on this, which is BYU is better than the half of the Power 5. They had a 58% of the Power 5 last year. BYU had an equal to or better record. But and then historically, BYU, people know BYU won the national championship, Heisman Trophy winners. BYU tied for 4th most wins the last 40 years. All of that. BYU is legit. However, in independence, BYU has not been nationally relevant, I think, as much as they've wanted to be. How is that factored into this decision by the ACC, Trevor?
I don't know that factors into it because BYU, I think, is nationally relevant. The thing is, because of independence, their schedule has been front-loaded with the best teams on their schedule very often because the best teams usually are having their non-conference play earlier in the season, and then they get into conference play, and they don't want to play a team like BYU during conference play. For example, you look at SEC teams, and most of them schedule somebody like Coastal Carolina or some other just small school in November, the week before their huge rival, so that they can rest their starters, give the backups a little bit of playing time, and then head into the big rivalry game. So BYU is not a team you want to play at a time like that. So because of that, from a national perspective, BYU, when they lose a couple of games, it's early. And then people turn their eyes away and don't see how well they're playing the rest of the season. So I think that's a bit of a misnomer, and I don't think that had much to do with the ACC's decision. I think it was more that their schedule is already very heavy. The ACC plays a lot of really tough non-conference teams, and so adding BYU to the mix, given that they've got to rotate Notre Dame through it, and given that they've got so many other big-name schools already on the schedule, and the definition of a non-conference game from a Power 5 conference every year for every team, then if you throw BYU into that in addition, well, all you're doing is scheduling yourself a potential loss.
Yeah. And I get that from the Notre Dame perspective, especially with the ACC. It's unique in that they'll have 5 games, like you said. I guess from my perspective, I think BYU could have been that they've been able to. The ACC can ignore BYU because they won 8 games the last 2 years. If BYU would have won 11 games the last 2 years each, then maybe they could have been in a can't ignore you situation. What do you think of that?
Well, I think the definition is important. I mean, ultimately, I think the hope for BYU fans is that BYU will be designated as an honorary member of the Power 5. If that's the case, then you've got conferences like the ACC, the SEC, et cetera, that are making a point to schedule at least one non-conference team from the Power 5. If BYU is thrown into that, then all of a sudden they are included in that basket, and they'll get scheduling any way they want, because now all of a sudden, instead of BYU replacing a team like a Coastal Carolina or a Villanova, BYU would be in there with any other team from the Pac-12, Big 12, et cetera, in a non-conference game with the ACC or the SEC. So really it's a matter of that definition, and that's what BYU needs to fight for and hope for.
Trevor Matich, ESPN college football analyst, joining BYU Sports Nation. So just to clarify, Trevor, you feel like these teams don't want to play BYU because they're essentially afraid of losing to BYU?
Well, I wouldn't put it that way. I mean, that's kind of fun to say that way, but I wouldn't put it that way. And the reason is, look at what the landscape of college football is right now. It's all about getting into the top 4. And to get into the top 4, you need to win. And you need to have a good strength of schedule. But when you don't want to load up your non-conference schedule unnecessarily. And so that's one of the reasons I think the SEC elected to stay with 8 conference games. Because if you had a 9th conference game in there, all of a sudden you give your entire conference 7 more losses over the course of the conference. 14 teams, 7 are going to win, 7 are going to lose if you add another conference game. So it gives another chance for the teams at the top to lose and get bounced out of the 14 playoff. It also gives you a chance to lose an extra game and get bounced out of what used to be called BCS bowls. Now I think they're calling them contract bowls. And it makes the middle of the conference less likely to fill out their bowl roster, because all of a sudden those teams that would have been 6-6 very likely are going to be, some of them are going to be 5-7 because they have to play an extra conference game instead of that extra cupcake to pad that win to sneak into a bowl. So from a conference standpoint, it does make sense, if you have to play a Power 5 team anyway, to not have one of those extra conference games be a team like BYU, unless BYU is defined as a Power 5.
Trevor Matich is on BYU Sports Nation. To me, the big picture concern, Trevor, is that if a wall is put up between the in and the out crowd, that BYU appears to be on the out by a hair. Is there any concern on your end as a former BYU player that BYU would be considered out if the lines were drawn right now?
Right now, I think if the lines are drawn, probably so. Probably so. I mean, Notre Dame would be the only independent that definitely would be considered one of those Power 5. And so BYU would need to make the case. And really that case would be financial. In other words, does the financial reward for playing BYU and risking a loss outweigh the risk of that loss? And so that's really the case they need to make. And the good thing about BYU is that it is a national brand. And it is a program that will draw people to your stadium when you play them at home. It's a program that will draw eyeballs, and it'll give you big ratings whenever you play them. And those are kind of the arguments, because when it comes down to it, college football is not about being inclusive. It's not about being nice to people on the bubble.
Yeah.
It's about protecting proprietary cash flow. And they don't want someone to come in and split the cash flow with them. They want someone to come in and enhance the cash flow. So that's where the argument needs to be made.
Trevor Matich, ESPN college football analyst on BYU Sports Nation, played 11 seasons in the NFL as well, 1984 national champion with BYU. Trevor, is it as simple as just winning? They want to press the issue. They want to be included. They want to get into a Power 5 conference at some point, probably. Is it as simple as winning, or is there more than that?
No, there's more than that. I mean, think about Colorado joining the Pac-12. That had nothing to do with winning. Not
Clearly,
anyway.
Clearly.
And so, and then you look Rutgers joining the Big Ten. Had nothing to do with enhancing the Big Ten's football resume. It had to do everything to do with bringing the New York market into the Big Ten network. That's what it had to do with.
Yeah.
And so, really, if BYU wins and they remain a team that's relevant nationally, and they become more relevant nationally now by winning early, so that the conversation around BYU continues nationally for a longer time, then they have a seat at the table to be able to make that case. That's not the only case to be made. I mean, when Boise State was winning, they were winning BCS bowls. Well, guess what? No major conference was knocking down their door to join their conference. Why? Well, because as good as Boise's football program is, they're in Boise.
Yeah, it's market
Boise's
112.
in Idaho.
That's market number
there
112.
There are 7 people in the state of Idaho. They're all 7 are wonderful people. They're wonderful, but still, it's a small market. So again, winning may get you a seat at the table, but money will allow you to get up from the table and then walk through that side door.
Is Salt Lake City a big enough market? It's market 33, I believe, in the demographics. Is Salt Lake City a big enough market to help BYU?
Did Utah prove that with the Pac-12?
I think in some ways, yeah. I think it is an important market, and is growing as well.
It's like Milwaukee.
And the thing is, it's also new money. And you have to think of what programs are available to come in. Like, if you take, for example, let's say the Big 12. Let's say BYU would join a power conference. Let's say that. The Big 12, they don't have a presence now in the Mountain West. Now, they've got Manhattan, Kansas. Wow, there's a market for you.
Ames,
but,
Iowa.
The Salt Lake City market, I think, would enhance the Big 12 television footprint tremendously. Plus the fact that BYU is not really a market team; it's more of a national team. And so, from joining a conference standpoint, I think the Salt Lake City market is a very attractive property for any conference that might add BYU. That's one of the reasons that Utah was able to join the Pac-12. BYU, by the way, will probably never join the Pac-12 just from a cultural standpoint. I mean, can you imagine, places like Berkeley, sitting down with places like Provo and saying, "Yeah, we have a lot in common."
Never.
There's a lot of differences there. But anyway, as far as other conferences, yeah. As an independent, all bets are off from that standpoint, because now it's not a matter of your television market; it's a matter of all these other factors.
So, Trevor, do you think the Pac-12 is totally out of the question forever? And do you think BYU will be in a Power 5 conference at some point in the future?
As it looks right now, the Pac-12, I believe, is out of the picture forever. And the biggest reason, I think, is Sunday play. The Mountain West, the Western Athletic Conference, were all willing to, West Coast Conference, all were conferences that were willing to not play on Sunday for the Olympic sports, for the tournament. So if the track team is winning in the conference tournament, et cetera, and all of a sudden you have a semifinal or a final to be played on a Sunday.
Right.
Well, the Mountain West and the WAC worked around BYU.
What if
the
it's
Pac-12,
football only?
I think, is very reluctant to do that.
Yeah, what if the Pac-12 or Big 12 took BYU on a football-only agreement and thus taking Sunday play out of the situation?
I've heard that said, and I'm trying to think of where it's ever been done before. Olympic sports go all over the place. I mean, Notre Dame's Olympic sports have bounced around a bit, and their football right now is a football-only relationship, I think, with the ACC. I'm not sure if basketball has that same relationship. But other than that, and by the way, they haven't officially joined the ACC. It's just a relationship. So it would be brand new if, for example, the Pac-12 became the Pac-14 and BYU was one of those teams, just hypothetically, and it was football only. I mean, it just seems weird. So I think that's less likely. To me, the most sense, if they do join a power conference, would be the Big 12. But personally, I think BYU has a lot going for it as an independent as long as they have a seat at the table. And if the power conferences freeze out BYU because of their new scheduling, then that's a problem for BYU. That really is a problem. So, BYU fans have got to hope that this doesn't spread too much.
Trevor Matich.
And it all comes down to the 8 versus 9 scheduling, et cetera. Because keep this in mind, ACC elected to stay with 8 conference games. The problem there is that if you're in different divisions, then you might see a cross-division opponent once every 11 years. Well, that's part of the price you pay for expanding your footprint to 14 teams. You make more money, but all of a sudden weird situations like that happen. And that's one of the reasons that, if they do go to 9 conference games, because the Pac-12's there now and others are too, then, adding BYU just makes it tougher.
Trevor Matich of ESPN, you are a scholar and a gentleman. We appreciate the insight. Just so you know, we have the in-studio masseuse ready to go anytime along with the world-class catering. So come back and enjoy the fruits of BYU broadcasting anytime.
You know what? I absolutely love to. Right now I'm at a small motel in a windswept town in the middle of nowhere in New Mexico. So that studio sounds luxurious to me.
Look out for the tumbleweeds. Thanks, Trevor. We appreciate the time.